The morning Mara Whitlock's life changed forever. She was scrubbing blood out of wooden floorboards. Not her blood. Never her blood. Mara had learned long ago that her own pain didn't matter much to anyone in Ridge Hollow, so she'd stopped expecting it to. The blood belonged to a trapper who'd stumbled into Gideon's trading post 3 days prior with a bear mauling that should have killed him. Should have, but didn't. Mara had cauterized the wounds herself while the man screamed and Gideon held him down, and she'd done it with the same grim efficiency she brought to every thankless task that fell into her lap, which was all of them. "You missed a spot," Gideon said from behind the counter, not looking up from his ledger. Mara didn't answer, just dipped her brush back into the bucket and scrubbed harder, her knees aching against the rough planks. At 28, she'd spent the better part of a decade living above this trading post, working 18-hour days for room, board, and the privilege of being ignored. Her hands were calloused and cracked, her back perpetually tight, and her face, well, her face was the kind people looked past without ever really seeing. Too square. Too serious. Too much jaw and not enough softness. She'd heard it all, usually whispered behind hands that weren't held quite high enough. Outside, Ridge Hollow was buried under 3 feet of February snow, the kind of cold that killed quietly if you weren't careful. The town itself was nothing special, maybe 200 souls clinging to the edge of the Montana territory, most of them harder than the ground they built on. Trappers, traders, a few families stubborn enough to think they could farm at this altitude. The kind of place where survival mattered more than kindness, and kindness was rationed like flour. Mara fit that description better than she fit anywhere else. The door slammed open. She looked up, brush still in hand, and watched Caleb Mercer stumble into the trading post like a man half dead. She'd seen Caleb before. Everyone had. He was the kind of presence you noticed even when you didn't want to. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He kept a cabin somewhere high in the mountains, came down maybe twice a year to trade pelts and restock supplies, and never stayed longer than necessary. People said he was dangerous. People said his wife was some missionary's daughter who'd followed him into the wilderness like a fool and gotten herself pregnant because she didn't know any better. People said a lot of things, but what Mara saw now wasn't dangerous. It was broken. Caleb's coat was torn, his face hollow with exhaustion, and something worse. Something raw. And in his arms, wrapped in what looked like half a bearskin, was a baby. A screaming baby. The sound cut through the trading post like a saw blade. High, desperate, relentless. The kind of crying that meant hunger or cold or pain, maybe all three. Caleb stood in the doorway, snow melting off his boots, and Mara watched his hands shake. "I need..." His voice cracked. "I need someone who knows about babies." Gideon straightened behind the counter, eyes narrowing. "What happened to your wife?" "Dead." The word landed like a stone in frozen water. "Dead how?" Gideon pressed, and there was no sympathy in his tone, just calculation. "Fever. 3 days after the baby came." Caleb's jaw worked. "I buried her yesterday." The baby screamed louder. Mara stood slowly, setting down her brush. Around the trading post, 6 people had gone silent, women mostly, the ones who'd come in for supplies or gossip or both. She recognized Sarah Hendricks, who had 4 children of her own, Martha Yates, whose youngest was barely a year old, even Ann Morrison, who everyone knew was desperate for a baby and hadn't managed to carry one past 5 months. Every single one of them looked at Caleb Mercer and his screaming child, and every single one of them stepped back. Not obviously, not cruelly, just a small shift in posture, a sudden interest in the jars on the shelves, a need to examine the fabric bolts in the corner. The message was clear enough. Not my problem. Because that's what it was, really. A problem. A mountain man with a dead wife and a newborn baby wasn't an opportunity. It was a burden. It was sleepless nights and dirty diapers and a man half mad with grief, who might vanish back into the wilderness at any moment, leaving whoever helped him holding a baby that wasn't theirs and a scandal that would stick like pitch. Mara understood. She'd spent her whole life understanding, but she also knew what it felt like to need help and find only silence. "Let me see her," she said. Caleb's head turned toward her, and for the first time he seemed to actually focus. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red that might have been cold or crying, or both. "You know about babies?" Enough, Mara lied. She didn't know a damn thing about babies, never held one longer than 30 seconds, never had reason to. But she knew about keeping things alive, injured trappers, sick animals, half-frozen travelers. How different could a baby be? She crossed the room and held out her arms. Caleb hesitated. His grip on the bundle tightened, and Mara saw something flicker across his face that might have been fear or might have been the last thread of a man holding himself together by sheer will. "She won't stop crying," he said, and there was an edge of desperation in his voice that made Mara's chest tighten. I don't know what she needs. Let me try." He handed over the baby like he was handing over a piece of his soul. The weight surprised her. Not heavy, but solid. Real. Mara adjusted her grip, pulling back the bearskin to see a tiny red face scrunched in misery, mouth open wide enough to show pink gums and no teeth. The baby's fists waved in the air, and her cries didn't stop, didn't even pause. Mara shifted her hold, tucking the baby against her chest the way she'd seen other women do. She started to sway, just slightly, a rocking motion that felt awkward and unnatural. And then, like someone had flipped a switch, the baby went quiet. Not gradual, not a slow wind down, just quiet. The silence was so sudden that Mara froze, terrified she'd somehow smothered the child by accident. But no, the baby was breathing, her tiny chest rising and falling against Mara's ribs. Her eyes, dark and unfocused, blinked up at nothing in particular, and one small fist found its way to her mouth. "Jesus," someone whispered. Mara looked up to find the entire trading post staring at her. Caleb's expression was unreadable. He stood there, arms still half extended where the baby had been, and Mara watched his throat work as he swallowed. "What did you do?" he asked. "I don't know." It was the truth. Mara had no idea why the baby had stopped crying. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe the crying had been about being jostled around in the cold, and now that she was still and warm, she'd settled. Maybe it was pure coincidence, but the women watching didn't see coincidence. They saw something else. "Natural touch," Martha Yates murmured, and there was something hard in her voice. "Some women just have it." It wasn't a compliment. Mara ignored her. She kept swaying, kept the baby tucked close, and tried not to think about the fact that she was holding someone's entire world in her arms and had absolutely no idea what to do next. "She needs to eat," Mara said, looking at Caleb. "When did she last eat?" "I don't—" He dragged a hand through his hair. "This morning, maybe? I've been trying to give her goat's milk, but she won't take much." "Goat's milk might be too rich. You need to water it down, warm it up." Mara had no idea if that was true, but it sounded reasonable. "And she needs to be changed. Do you have clean cloths?" Caleb nodded. "Then we'll start there." She didn't ask permission, just carried the baby toward the back room where Gideon kept a stove going, leaving Caleb to follow. Behind her, the trading post erupted in whispers. She could hear them like wasps, buzzing, sharp and mean. Always knew she was desperate. Trying to trap him, mark my words. Poor man doesn't know what he's gotten into. Mara's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn around. Let them talk. They'd been talking about her for years. One more day wouldn't kill her. In the back room, she laid the baby on a clean piece of canvas and unwrapped the bearskin. Underneath, the baby wore a tiny dress that might have been white once but was now gray with use and stained with God knew what. Her diaper, just a rag tied at the sides, was soaked through. "You got fresh cloths?" Mara asked. Caleb dug through a pack he'd dropped by the door and pulled out a handful of rags that looked only marginally cleaner than what the baby was wearing. Mara made a mental note to boil water later. She worked quickly, changing the baby with hands that trembled slightly but got the job done. The baby fussed a little but didn't cry, and Mara counted that as a victory. Once she was clean and wrapped in a dry rag that would have to pass for a diaper, Mara bundled her back into the bearskin and looked at Caleb. "She needs proper clothes. Diapers, blankets. You can't keep hauling her around in a bearskin." "I know that," Caleb said, and there was a snap in his voice that Mara recognized, embarrassment disguised as anger. "I'm not an idiot." "Didn't say you were." "Then stop." He stopped, took a breath. "I'm doing the best I can." "I know." And she did. Looking at him now, really looking, Mara saw a man who'd probably slept 10 hours total in the past week. A man who'd lost his wife and gained a responsibility he had no idea how to handle. A man who'd walk through a blizzard to reach a town that didn't particularly like him because he didn't know where else to go. She knew what that felt like, too. "I need to warm some milk," Mara said. "You want to hold her while I do?" Caleb looked at the baby like she might explode. "I'll drop her." "You won't." "I might." "Caleb," Mara's voice came out sharper than she intended. "You carried her down a mountain in a snowstorm. You can hold her for 5 minutes while I heat milk." He took the baby back with the same terrified care he'd shown before, and Mara turned to the stove. There was a pot of goat's milk sitting nearby, probably left from the morning, and she poured some into a tin cup, added a splash of water, and set it on the heat. Behind her, she heard Caleb start to hum. It was barely a sound, low and rough, more vibration than melody. But the baby settled even further, her eyes drifting shut, and Mara felt something twist in her chest. "She likes that," Mara said quietly. Her mother used to sing to her. Caleb's voice was flat. "I don't know the words." "The tune's enough." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackling of the stove and Caleb's rough humming. Mara tested the milk with her finger, warm but not hot, and poured it into a small glass bottle with a rag twisted into the top. It was the best she could do without a proper nursing bottle. "Try this," she said, handing it to Caleb. He shifted the baby into the crook of one arm and pressed the rag tip to her mouth. At first, the baby just mouthed it, confused. Then her lips closed around the fabric and she started to suck, pulling milk through the rag in small, messy gulps. Caleb's whole body sagged with relief. "There you go," Mara murmured. "There you go." The baby ate slowly, pausing every few seconds to breathe, milk dribbling down her chin. It was messy and inefficient and probably the wrong way to do it, but it was working, and that was all that mattered. When the baby finally pushed the bottle away, her eyes were closed and her breathing had evened out into sleep. "Now what?" Caleb asked. "Now you let her sleep." "And then?" Mara looked at him. "Then you figure out what you're going to do." Caleb's expression shuddered. "I'm taking her to the mission in Clearwater. It's a 3-day ride, maybe 4 in the snow. They'll know how to care for her." "You're giving her away." "I'm giving her a chance." His voice was tight. "I can't raise a baby on my own. I'm gone for weeks at a time, living in a cabin with no heat and barely enough food. What kind of life is that for her?" "Better than an orphanage." "It's not an orphanage, it's a mission. They'll find her a family." "They'll find her a family. Not hers." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Her family is dead." The words hung in the air like frost. Mara knew she should stop, should back down. It wasn't her place to tell this man what to do with his own child. But something in her chest was burning, something that felt like anger and grief, and a lifetime of being unwanted, and she couldn't quite swallow it back. "You're her family," Mara said. "You're all she's got." "And I'm not enough." Caleb's voice cracked. "I can't do this alone." "Then don't." The words came out before Mara could stop them. Caleb stared at her. "What?" "Don't do it alone." Mara's heart was pounding now, her hands shaking. She was crossing a line she couldn't uncross, saying things she couldn't take back. But she'd spent 28 years playing it safe, being quiet, waiting for someone to choose her, and it had gotten her exactly nowhere. Maybe it was time to choose herself. "Marry me," Mara said. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the snow hitting the window. Caleb's face went blank with shock. "What?" "You need help with the baby. I need—" She stopped. What did she need? A way out of this town? A purpose? A chance to matter? All of it felt too big and too honest to say out loud. "I need a life that isn't this, so marry me. We'll raise her together." "You don't even know me. I know you walked through a blizzard to get help for your daughter. That's more than most men would do." Caleb looked lost. I don't love you." "I don't love you either." The words should have hurt, but they didn't. They were just true. "This isn't about love. It's about survival." "That's insane." "Maybe." Mara met his eyes. "But it's better than the alternative." Caleb looked down at the baby sleeping in his arms. His daughter. His responsibility. The tiny life that had already lost one parent and was about to lose the other. "I can't ask you to do this," he said quietly. "You're not asking. I'm offering. Why? It was a fair question. Mara didn't have a good answer. Or maybe she had too many answers, all tangled up together. Because she was tired of being invisible. Because she knew what it felt like to be unwanted. Because when she'd held that baby and felt her go quiet, something in Mara's chest had cracked open, and now she couldn't close it again. Because someone should, Mara said finally, and it might as well be me. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked back down at his daughter, and Mara watched something shift in his expression, resignation maybe, or just bone-deep exhaustion. All right, he said. Mara blinked. All right? We'll do it. He swallowed. We'll get married. The room tilted slightly. Mara had expected him to argue, to refuse, to tell her she was crazy and walk out the door. She hadn't actually expected him to say yes. There's conditions, Caleb said, and his voice had gone hard now, businesslike. This is a partnership, nothing more. You help me raise Rose. Rose? That's her name, Rose. His hand moved over the baby's head, a gesture so gentle it made Mara's throat tight. Her mother's name was Caroline, and she said if it was a girl, we'd call her Rose. Rose, Mara repeated. It was a soft name, a pretty name, the kind of name that didn't belong in a place like Ridge Hollow. You help me raise Rose, Caleb continued, and I'll provide for you, food, shelter, protection. But this isn't, we're not. I know what it isn't, Mara cut in. I'm not expecting a love story. Good. He shifted the baby in his arms, because I already had one of those. It should have stung. Maybe it did, a little. But Mara had spent her whole life coming in second, and at least this time she knew where she stood from the start. When? She asked. Tomorrow. We'll find whoever does marriages in this town and get it done. Then we leave. Leave for where? The foothills. I've got land there. Not much, but enough. We'll build a cabin, start fresh. His eyes met hers, and there was something fierce in them now. Away from all this. He didn't have to explain what this was. Mara understood. The gossip, the judgment, the eyes that would follow them everywhere, dissecting every interaction, waiting for the marriage to fail so they could say they knew it all along. Tomorrow then, Mara said. They shook hands like business partners, formal and strange, while baby Rose slept between them. And somewhere in the front of the trading post, the whispers had already started. News spread through Ridge Hollow faster than fire through dry grass. By sunset, everyone knew that Mara Whitlock, plain, desperate Mara, had snared herself a husband, a grieving widower no less, a man who'd been married less than a year and had barely finished burying his wife before Mara swooped in like a vulture. At least, that's how Sarah Hendricks told it. Shameful, she said to anyone who'd listen. That poor man isn't thinking straight, and she's taking advantage. Maybe she really wants to help, someone suggested half-heartedly. Sarah snorted. Help herself, more like. She's been rotting in that trading post for 10 years, and suddenly a man shows up with a baby and she's playing saint? Please. In the church, such as it was, more of a meeting hall with a cross nailed to the wall, Reverend Thomas listened to the story with a furrowed brow. He asked for this, the Reverend pressed. She proposed, Martha Yates said, scandalized. What kind of woman proposes to a man? The desperate kind, Ann Morrison muttered. The Reverend sighed. He was 63, had been in Ridge Hollow for 20 years, and had seen just about every flavor of human foolishness the frontier had to offer. This wasn't the worst. If they're both willing, he said carefully, I don't see grounds to refuse. But, Reverend, I'll speak with them tomorrow before the ceremony. Make sure they understand what they're entering into. He held up a hand to forestall further protest. But if they still want to proceed, I'll marry them. The child needs a mother, and Mr. Mercer needs help. If Miss Whitlock is willing to provide it, that's between them and the Lord. It wasn't the condemnation the women had been hoping for, but it was something. Meanwhile, in the room above the trading post, Mara packed her things. There wasn't much. 2 dresses, both patched, a coat that had been old when she got it, a pair of boots that needed re-zoling, a tin cup, a spoon, and a small knife, the sum total of 28 years of living. She folded everything into a canvas bag and tried not to think about what she was doing, tried not to think about the fact that she was marrying a stranger, tried not to think about the way the baby had felt in her arms, solid and warm and real. tried not to think about the women's voices drifting up from below, sharp with judgment. She'll regret it. Give it 3 months, he'll be gone. Probably leave her with the baby and disappear into the mountains. Serves her right for being so desperate. Mara sat down on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her hands against her knees. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe Caleb would abandon her and she'd end up right back here, except now she'd have a baby to care for and a failed marriage hanging around her neck like a noose. But maybe it would work. And even if it didn't, even if the worst happened, at least she would have tried. At least she would have chosen something for herself instead of waiting for life to choose her. That had to count for something. Downstairs, the trading post door opened and closed. Footsteps on the stairs. Mara looked up as Caleb appeared in the doorway, Rose bundled against his chest in a sling someone had scrounged up. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine." "You don't look fine." Mara almost laughed. "What am I supposed to look like?" Caleb shrugged. "I don't know. Happy, maybe?" "Are you happy?" "No." At least he was honest. He stepped into the room, and Mara saw that he'd cleaned up, washed his face, combed his hair, changed into a shirt that didn't have blood on it. He still looked exhausted, but less like a man on the edge of collapse. "I talked to the Reverend," Caleb said. "He'll do the ceremony tomorrow at noon. Wants to speak with us first, make sure we know what we're getting into." "And what are we getting into?" "Hell if I know." This time Mara did laugh, short and sharp. "At least we're honest about it." Caleb sat down on the room's only chair, adjusting Rose in his arms. The baby was awake now, her dark eyes blinking slowly, one fist shoved in her mouth. "She's going to need more than I can give her," Caleb said quietly. "I know that. I'm gone half the year, and when I'm home, I'm not good with people. Never have been. Caroline used to say I had the social skills of a bear trap. She sounds like she had a sense of humor." "She did." His voice went rough. She was good. Better than this place deserved, better than I deserved." Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "I can't replace her," Caleb continued. "I can't be what Rose needs on my own. But if you're willing to try, if you really mean this, then I'll do everything I can to make it work. I'll provide. I'll protect. You'll be her father," Mara finished. "That's what she needs. The rest we'll figure out as we go." Caleb met her eyes, and for the first time Mara saw something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. I might be terrible at this." "Can't be worse than me." They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers bound by a decision that still felt surreal. Outside, the snow had started falling again, soft and relentless, burying Ridge Hollow under another layer of white. Tomorrow, Mara thought, she'd marry a man she didn't know. Tomorrow, she'd become a mother to a child who wasn't hers. Tomorrow, her entire life would change. And sitting there in that cold, narrow room above the trading post, listening to the wind howl and the baby breathe, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was terrifying. The wedding was a grim affair. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony in the church with exactly 4 people in attendance: Caleb, Mara, Gideon, who'd been dragged along as a witness, and Martha Yates, who wouldn't have missed this for the world. Rose slept through the whole thing, bundled in Mara's arms. "Do you, Caleb Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Mara Whitlock, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." No kiss, no celebration, just a scratched signature in the church record and a handshake that felt more like a business contract than a marriage. Outside, the town watched through frost-covered windows. "Well," Gideon said, clapping Caleb on the shoulder with something that might have been sympathy. "Good luck to you both." It didn't sound like he meant it. Martha Yates didn't bother with pleasantries. She just looked at Mara with something cold and knowing in her eyes. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. Mara met her gaze. "Maybe, but it'll be my regret, not yours." They left Ridge Hollow that afternoon. Caleb had a horse and a mule loaded with supplies, and he'd fashioned a sling that kept Rose secure against Mara's chest while they rode. The snow was still falling, turning the world into a blur of white, and Mara had never ridden for more than an hour at a time in her life. By the time the sun set, her legs were screaming and her back felt like it might snap. "There's a trapper's shelter about a mile ahead," Caleb called back to her. "We'll stop there for the night." Mara just nodded, too tired to speak. The shelter was barely a shelter, 4 walls and a roof, no door, snow drifted in the corners. But it blocked the wind, and once Caleb got a fire going, it was almost warm. Mara fed Rose while Caleb tended the animals. The baby ate slowly, her eyes drifting shut, and by the time she was done, she was asleep again. "She sleeps a lot," Mara said. "Newborns do." Caleb settled on the other side of the fire, pulling out a piece of dried meat to chew. "She'll wake up every few hours wanting to eat, though. Hope you're ready for that." Mara wasn't ready for any of this, but she was here anyway. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind howled like something alive. "You'll need to learn to shoot," Caleb said eventually. "Why?" "Because we're going to be alone out there. Bears, wolves, mountain lions. They don't care that you're a woman. You need to be able to protect yourself. Protect Rose." Mara looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms. "All right. And you'll need to learn the land, where the water runs, which plants are safe, how to read the weather." "All right." And he stopped. "This isn't going to be easy. You know that, right?" "I know. Ridge Hollow is going to look like paradise compared to the foothills. We'll be working from dawn to dark just to survive, and winter." His jaw tightened. "Winter's brutal up there. You might not make it through the first one." "I might not," Mara agreed, "but I'm going to try anyway." Caleb studied her across the fire, and Mara wondered what he saw. A fool? A woman so desperate for a different life that she'd gamble everything on a stranger? Maybe both. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." Mara lay down on the cold ground with Rose tucked against her chest, wrapped in every blanket they had. The fire burned low, and the wind screamed outside, and somewhere in the darkness she heard something howl. This was her life now. No going back. She closed her eyes and tried not to be afraid. The foothills weren't what Mara had imagined. She'd pictured something gentler, rolling meadows maybe, patches of forest, the kind of landscape that made you think of new beginnings. What she got instead was rock and scrub pine, and slopes so steep her horse struggled with every step. The cold bit through her coat like teeth, and by the 3rd day of riding, she'd stopped feeling her toes entirely. Rose cried through most of it, not the desperate screaming from that first day in the trading post, but a constant, miserable fussing that frayed Mara's nerves like old rope. The baby was cold, probably hungry even though Mara fed her every chance she got, and definitely uncomfortable in the sling that kept slipping no matter how many times Mara adjusted it. "How much further?" Mara called ahead to Caleb. "Another hour, maybe 2. It had been another hour for the past 6 hours. Mara gritted her teeth and kept riding. Behind her, the mule carrying their supplies plodded along with the resigned patience of an animal that had seen worse. Ahead, Caleb sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, his shoulders broad against the gray sky. He hadn't said more than 20 words since they'd left the shelter that morning. When they finally stopped, it was in a clearing that looked like every other clearing they'd passed, surrounded by scrub pine, carpeted in snow, with a view of absolutely nothing but more mountains. "Here," Caleb said, dismounting. Mara looked around. "Here what?" "Here's where we build." There was nothing here. No cabin, no structure, not even the foundation of something that used to be. Just trees and rocks and snow. "I thought you said you had land," Mara said carefully. "I do. This is it." "But where's the cabin?" Caleb started unloading the mule, his movements efficient and practiced. "We're going to build it." "From scratch?" "You were expecting what? A house with curtains?" The edge in his voice stopped Mara from saying anything else. She dismounted carefully, her legs shaking, and adjusted Rose in the sling. The baby had finally fallen asleep, her small face pressed against Mara's chest, and Mara wasn't about to wake her by arguing. They spent the rest of the afternoon setting up a temporary shelter, essentially a lean-to made from canvas and pine branches that blocked some of the wind, but none of the cold. Caleb worked with the kind of brutal efficiency that came from years of doing things alone, and Mara tried to help while keeping Rose warm and dry. It didn't go well. "You're doing it wrong," Caleb said, watching her struggle with a rope. "Then show me the right way." He reached over and took the rope from her hands, his fingers quick and sure as he tied a knot that actually held. Like that. Fine. I'm not criticizing. I'm teaching. Feels the same. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Just went back to hammering stakes into the frozen ground with more force than was strictly necessary. By nightfall, they had something that resembled shelter. Caleb got a fire going while Mara fed Rose, and they ate a cold supper of dried meat and hard bread that tasted like sawdust. Tomorrow we start clearing trees, Caleb said, staring into the fire. We'll need logs for the cabin walls, and we'll need them soon. Snow's only going to get worse. Mara looked at the forest around them. Hundreds of trees, maybe thousands, all of them taller than any building she'd ever seen. How long will it take? To clear enough trees? A week, maybe 2 if the weather holds. And to build the cabin? Another month, maybe more. Mara's stomach sank. A month living in a canvas lean-to with a newborn baby and winter bearing down on them. She'd known this wouldn't be easy, but knowing and experiencing were 2 very different things. We'll freeze, she said quietly. We'll work fast. It wasn't reassurance, just fact. That night Mara lay in the lean-to with Rose bundled against her chest and listened to the wind tear through the trees. Caleb slept on the other side of the fire, or pretended to sleep, she couldn't tell which. The temperature dropped so low that her breath came out in clouds, and she kept checking to make sure Rose was still breathing, still warm, still alive. This was insane. She had married a stranger and followed him into the wilderness to build a cabin with her bare hands while caring for a newborn. If anyone from Ridge Hollow could see her now, they'd say she'd gotten exactly what she deserved. Maybe she had. The next morning came too early and too cold. Mara woke to Rose screaming and Caleb already up, sharpening an axe by the fire. Her whole body ached. Muscles she didn't know she had were announcing themselves with sharp, insistent pain. Here, Caleb said, handing her a tin cup of something hot. Mara took it gratefully. It was pine needle tea, bitter and medicinal, but it was warm and that was enough. You know how to use an axe? Caleb asked. No. Then today you learn. He showed her how to hold it, how to swing, how to aim for the same spot over and over until the tree started to crack. It looked easy when he did it. When Mara tried, the axe bounced off the bark and nearly took off her foot. Again, Caleb said. Mara swung again, and again, and again. By the 10th swing, her arms were shaking. By the 20th, she could barely lift the axe. That's enough, Caleb said, taking the axe from her. You'll build up to it. It should have been encouraging, but it just made Mara feel useless. She'd spent 10 years working at the trading post, lifting heavy crates and hauling water, and she'd thought that made her strong. Apparently, it didn't make her strong enough. While Caleb worked on felling trees, Mara took care of Rose and tried to make their temporary camp less miserable. She boiled water for washing, hung wet diapers to dry by the fire, and attempted to cook something resembling a meal with their limited supplies. The diapers froze before they could dry. The meal burned, and Rose cried through all of it, a constant soundtrack of misery that made Mara want to scream. What's wrong with her? Mara finally asked, jiggling the baby in her arms for what felt like the 1,000th time. Caleb looked up from the tree he was working on, sweat freezing on his forehead despite the cold. How should I know? You're her father, and you're her mother now. Figure it out. The words hit harder than Mara expected. Not because they were cruel, Caleb's tone was matter of fact, not mean, but because they were true. She was Rose's mother now. This tiny, screaming person was her responsibility, and she had no idea what she was doing. Mara checked the baby's diaper. Dry. Tried to feed her. Rose turned her head away. Checked for fever. Nothing obvious. The baby just cried, her small face red and scrunched, and Mara felt panic rising in her chest. Maybe she's sick, Mara said. Caleb set down his axe and came over. He put a hand on Rose's forehead, then felt her hands and feet. She's not sick, just unhappy. That's not helpful. Welcome to babies. He went back to work, leaving Mara standing there with a crying infant and no solutions. She tried walking around the clearing, bouncing Rose gently. Tried humming the way Caleb had that first day. Tried everything she could think of. Finally, exhausted and desperate, Mara sat down by the fire and just held the baby close, letting her cry. I don't know what you need, Mara whispered. I'm sorry. I'm trying. Rose cried for another 10 minutes, then hiccuped, then slowly quieted. Not because Mara had done anything right, but because she'd tired herself out. Mara looked down at the baby's red, tear-stained face and felt something crack open in her chest. This tiny person had lost her mother, had been dragged through a blizzard and handed to a stranger, had every right to be miserable. "I know," Mara murmured, smoothing Rose's dark hair. "I know it's hard, but we're going to be okay. I promise." It was a lie. She had no idea if they'd be okay, but she said it anyway because sometimes that's all you can do. The days blurred together into a rhythm of work and survival. Caleb felled trees from dawn until dark, his axe biting into wood with steady, relentless strikes. Mara learned to strip branches, to stack logs, to keep the fire going in wind that tried to kill it. She learned to change diapers with numb fingers, to warm milk while balancing a baby on her hip, to function on 3 hours of sleep broken into 20-minute increments. She learned that Rose hated being cold but also hated being too warm, that she'd only settle if held in a very specific position against Mara's left shoulder, that she had a cry that meant hunger, and a different cry that meant tired, and a third cry that meant nothing Mara could identify but required walking in circles until it stopped. She learned that motherhood was nothing like she'd imagined and harder than anything she'd ever done. 2 weeks in, the first real storm hit. Mara woke to wind so strong it was tearing at the canvas lean-to, threatening to rip the whole structure apart. Snow was coming down sideways, and the temperature had dropped so low that the water in their bucket had frozen solid. "We need to reinforce the shelter," Caleb shouted over the wind. They worked together in the howling darkness, Mara holding canvas in place while Caleb hammered stakes deeper into the frozen ground. Rose was screaming inside the lean-to, but there was nothing Mara could do except work faster. By the time they finished, Mara's hands were so cold she couldn't feel them, and Rose's cries had taken on a desperate edge that made Mara's heart race. "She's freezing," Mara said, grabbing the baby and tucking her inside her own coat, against her skin. Caleb fed more wood to the fire, building it up until it was dangerously hot. "Keep her close to you. Share body heat." Mara did, holding Rose against her chest and wrapping every blanket they had around both of them. Slowly, the baby's cries quieted, and her small body stopped shivering. "How long will this storm last?" Mara asked. Caleb's expression was grim. "Could be hours. Could be days." It was 3 days. 3 days trapped in a canvas shelter that leaked and sagged and felt like it might blow away at any moment. 3 days of rationing food because they couldn't get to the supplies buried under snow. 3 days of taking turns sleeping because someone had to keep the fire going or they'd all freeze to death. By the time the storm finally broke, Mara was so exhausted she could barely stand. But Caleb didn't give her time to rest. "We lost 4 days," he said, already grabbing his axe. "We need to make it up." "Caleb, we just survived a blizzard, can't we?" "No." His voice was flat. "Winter's coming faster than I thought. If we don't get walls up soon, we won't make it through." He was right, and Mara hated him for it. She strapped Rose to her chest and went back to work, her whole body screaming in protest. They'd cleared maybe a third of the trees they needed, and each day felt like pushing a boulder uphill. Mara's hands were covered in blisters that had burst and bled and turned into calluses. Her shoulders ached constantly. And Rose, strapped against her chest for hours at a time, seemed to absorb Mara's exhaustion and reflect it back as crying. "I need help," Mara said one evening, her voice cracking. Caleb looked up from the rabbit he was skinning. "With what?" "With her, with Rose. I can't work and take care of her at the same time. I can't—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I'm drowning here." Caleb's expression didn't change. "What do you want me to do?" "Take her for a few hours. Let me sleep. Let me have a moment where I'm not responsible for keeping a human alive. I'm working. So am I. Building this cabin is more important than keeping your daughter fed and changed and alive?" Mara's voice rose. "Really?" Caleb set down his knife, his jaw tight. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" "I meant that we have priorities. Walls, roof, heat. Without those, Rose dies anyway. And while you're building walls, who's taking care of her? Who's making sure she eats, that she's warm, that she's not lying in her own filth for hours?" "You are. That's what you agreed to." "I agreed to be her mother, not her only parent." The words hung in the cold air between them. Caleb stood slowly, and Mara saw something flash across his face. Anger, maybe, or guilt, or some combination of the two. "You want me to take her?" he asked quietly. "Yes." "Fine." He held out his arms, and Mara handed over the baby. Rose immediately started fussing, her small face scrunching up in confusion. Caleb held her awkwardly, his large hands uncertain, and within 30 seconds Rose was screaming. "She needs to eat," Mara said. "Then feed her." "I just told you I need a break." "And I'm telling you she needs to eat." Caleb thrust the baby back at Mara. "I can't feed her, you can, so feed her." Mara took Rose back, tears of frustration burning in her eyes. "This isn't working." "What isn't working?" "This. Us. I can't do everything, Caleb. I can't be her mother and build a cabin and survive on no sleep and pretend like this is sustainable." "Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest you actually be her father instead of acting like she's my responsibility alone." Caleb's face went hard. "I'm doing everything I can." "No, you're doing everything you think is important, but Rose needs more than walls and a roof. She needs a parent who actually looks at her." "I look at her." "When? When's the last time you held her for longer than 5 minutes? When's the last time you fed her, or changed her, or did anything besides hand her back to me?" Caleb didn't answer. "That's what I thought," Mara said quietly. She turned away, cradling Rose against her chest, and walked to the other side of the clearing. Behind her, she heard Caleb pick up his axe and start working again, each strike harder than the last. That night, they didn't speak. Mara fed Rose, changed her, and put her down to sleep in the makeshift cradle Caleb had built from pine branches. Then she sat by the fire and stared into the flames, too tired to cry and too angry to sleep. "She looks like her mother." Mara looked up. Caleb was sitting on the other side of the fire, his face half in shadow. "Caroline," he continued, "Rose looks like her. Same eyes, same mouth." Mara didn't know what to say to that. "Every time I look at her, I see what I lost." Caleb's voice was rough. "And it's easier not to look." "That's not fair to Rose." "I know." He dragged a hand through his hair. "I know it's not, but I don't know how to—" He stopped. Caroline was good at this, the baby stuff. She would have known what to do. But Caroline's not here. I am. "I know that too." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. "I'm sorry," Caleb said finally. "You're right. I've been putting everything on you, and that's not what we agreed to." "No, it's not. But I don't know how to do this. How to be a father to a baby. How to be around her without feeling like I'm being torn apart." Mara looked at him across the fire, and for the first time she saw past the hard exterior to the grief underneath. He was drowning too, just in a different way. "You don't have to know how," Mara said quietly. "You just have to try." Caleb nodded slowly. "All right. And I need you to actually help, not just with the cabin, with her." "I will, starting tomorrow." "Starting tomorrow," Caleb agreed. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even close to fixing the 1,000 other problems they had, but it was something. The next morning, Caleb took Rose while Mara stripped branches from felled logs. He held the baby stiffly, like she might break, and Rose fussed and squirmed in his arms. But he didn't hand her back. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his expression somewhere between terrified and determined. "Talk to her," Mara called over. "About what?" "Anything. She likes voices." Caleb looked down at Rose, then started talking. Mara couldn't hear what he was saying, but his voice was low and steady, and after a few minutes, Rose settled. It was a small thing, but in a life made up of small, hard things, it felt like progress. They fell into a new rhythm after that. Caleb would work on the cabin in the mornings while Mara took care of Rose. Then they'd switch. Mara would help with construction while Caleb handled the baby. It wasn't perfect. Rose still cried more often than not when Caleb held her, and there were days when they were both so exhausted that they snapped at each other over nothing. But slowly, things got a little bit easier. The cabin walls started to rise. First just corner posts driven deep into the ground, then logs notched and fitted together, each one heavy enough that it took both of them to lift it into place. The work was backbreaking, and there were days when Mara thought her body might actually give out. "Higher," Caleb would say, and Mara would grit her teeth and lift higher. "Hold it steady," he'd say, and Mara would hold it steady even when her arms were shaking. Again, he'd say, and Mara would do it again. She learned to read the weather by the color of the sky, learned to tell which trees would fall where, which logs were too rotted to use, which knots would hold, and which would slip. She learned the particular ache of muscles pushed past their limit, the sharp sting of wood splinters driven deep, the bone-deep cold that no fire could quite chase away. She also learned that she was stronger than she'd thought. One afternoon, a log slipped while they were lifting it into place. It swung toward Caleb's head, and Mara threw herself forward, catching the log with her shoulder and stopping it before it could crack his skull open. The impact drove her to her knees. "Jesus," Caleb swore, grabbing the log and shoving it back into position. "You all right?" Mara's shoulder was screaming, but she nodded. "Fine." "That could have killed you." "Could have killed you too." Caleb stared at her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he held out a hand and pulled her to her feet. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mara just nodded, cradling her shoulder. That night, her whole left side had turned purple with bruising, and she could barely lift her arm. Caleb made her sit by the fire while he took care of Rose, feeding her and changing her with the kind of careful attention that still looked awkward but was getting better. "You should rest tomorrow," Caleb said. "We can't afford for me to rest. We can't afford for you to break your arm either." "I'll be fine." "Mara, I said I'll be fine." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not some delicate thing that needs protecting." "I know that, but you're also not invincible." "Neither are you." Caleb smiled faintly. "Fair enough." By the time the walls were finished, it was late October, and the temperature was dropping every night. They'd beaten the worst of the storms by a week, maybe less. The roof went up next, rough-cut shingles that Caleb split by hand, each one fitted and nailed into place. Mara helped where she could, but mostly she focused on making the inside of the cabin livable. She chinked the gaps between logs with mud and moss, built a stone hearth for the fireplace, and constructed a bed frame from pine branches lashed together with rope. It wasn't pretty, but it was theirs. The day they moved in, snow was already falling. Caleb carried Rose across the threshold while Mara hauled their supplies inside, and for the first time in 2 months, they slept with actual walls around them. It felt like a miracle. But the celebration was short-lived. Winter hit hard and fast, bringing with it storms that buried the cabin under feet of snow and temperatures so cold that water froze in the bucket before Mara could carry it inside. They were isolated now, truly isolated. No neighbors for miles, no town to fall back on, just the three of them and the relentless cold. Caleb had stockpiled food, but not enough. They were running low on flour, sugar, salt, all the things that made survival bearable instead of just possible. He'd need to make a supply run soon, which meant leaving Mara and Rose alone for days, maybe a week. "I don't like it," Caleb said, staring out at the snow. "We don't have a choice. I could wait until spring." "We'll starve before spring." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then I'll go fast. 3 days down to the trading outpost, 1 day to trade, 3 days back." "A week," Mara said. "A week," Caleb agreed. He left on a clear morning in November, his pack loaded with furs to trade. Mara stood in the doorway holding Rose and watched him disappear into the trees, and for the first time since they'd left Ridge Hollow, she felt truly alone. The first day wasn't bad. Mara kept busy, feeding Rose, tending the fire, rationing what food they had left. The second day was harder. The isolation pressed in on her, and every sound outside made her jump. The third day, Rose developed a cough. It was just a small thing at first, a tickle that made the baby fuss and squirm. But by the fourth day, the cough had gotten worse, and Rose's breathing sounded wet and labored. Mara tried everything, kept Rose warm, fed her honey water, held her upright so she could breathe easier. Nothing helped. By the fifth day, Rose was burning with fever, her small body hot to the touch, and Mara was terrified. "Come on," Mara whispered, holding the baby close. "Come on, sweetheart, fight this." But Rose just cried, a weak, pitiful sound that broke Mara's heart. The sixth day, the fever spiked. Rose's eyes were glassy and unfocused, and her breathing came in short, desperate gasps. Mara knew, she knew, that if the fever didn't break soon, the baby would die. And Caleb wasn't here. Mara paced the cabin, Rose limp in her arms, and tried to think. She needed help, needed someone who knew about babies and fevers and how to keep a child alive. But the nearest person was miles away, and the snow outside was 3 feet deep. She looked out the window at the white wasteland and made a decision. She was going for help. It was insane. She knew it was insane. Walking into a blizzard with a sick baby was suicide, but staying here and watching Rose die was worse. Mara bundled Rose in every blanket they had, strapped her against her chest, and pulled on Caleb's spare coat. It was too big, but it was warmer than hers. She grabbed the rifle, barely knew how to use it, but it was better than nothing, and opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall. Mara took a breath, looked down at Rose's flushed face, and stepped into the snow. She had no idea where she was going, just knew that there was a trapper's shelter somewhere to the south, maybe 2 miles, maybe 5. If she could find it, maybe someone would be there. Maybe they'd have medicine. Maybe they'd know what to do. Maybe it was all she had. The snow was so deep that each step took effort, and within minutes, Mara was gasping for breath. Rose was a small hot weight against her chest, and Mara could feel the fever burning through the blankets. "Stay with me," Mara whispered. "Just stay with me." She walked until her legs were numb, walked until she couldn't feel her face, walked until the world narrowed down to just the next step, and then the next, and then the next. And then she saw smoke, a thin thread of it rising above the trees, almost invisible against the gray sky. Mara stumbled toward it, her heart pounding, and when she broke through the tree line, she saw the shelter. It was barely a building, more of a shack, really, but there was smoke coming from the chimney, which meant someone was inside. Mara pounded on the door. It opened, and a grizzled man with a beard down to his chest stared at her in shock. "Help!" Mara gasped. "Please, the baby!" He pulled her inside without another word. The man's name was Dutch, and he had a face like worn leather and hands that moved with surprising gentleness as he took Rose from Mara's arms. "How long's she been like this?" he asked, laying the baby on a rough table near the fire. 2 days. Maybe 3. Mara's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. "The fever won't break." Dutch unwrapped the blankets and put his hand on Rose's forehead, then her chest. His expression didn't change, but Mara saw something flicker in his eyes that made her stomach drop. "She's bad," he said. "I know she's bad. Can you help her?" "Maybe." Dutch crossed to a shelf and pulled down a tin box. "Depends on whether she's got the strength to fight." He mixed something in a cup. Herbs Mara didn't recognize, hot water, a spoonful of honey. Then he lifted Rose's head and coaxed the mixture into her mouth, drop by drop. The baby sputtered and coughed, but Dutch was patient, waiting between each swallow. "What is that?" Mara asked. "Willow bark, elderberry, some other things. Might bring the fever down, might not." He glanced at Mara. "You walked here in this weather?" "I didn't have a choice. You could have stayed put, waited for the father to come back. She would have died." Dutch nodded slowly, like that made sense to him. "You're Mercer's new wife. Heard about that. Whole territory's talking about it." Mara didn't care what the whole territory was talking about. She crossed to the table and looked down at Rose, whose eyes were closed now, her breathing still labored, but maybe, slightly easier. "She going to make it?" Mara asked. "Don't know yet. Fever like this, it either breaks or it doesn't. We'll know by morning." Morning felt like a lifetime away. Dutch made Mara sit by the fire and drink something hot that tasted like mud but warmed her from the inside out. Then he took off her boots and checked her feet for frostbite. 2 of her toes were white and numb, and he rubbed them until the blood came back and the pain made Mara gasp. "Stupid thing you did," he said, not unkindly, "walking out in a storm like that." "I know. Could have died, both of you." "I know that too." Dutch studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "Well, you didn't, so there's that." They sat in silence for a while, watching Rose sleep. Every few minutes, Dutch would check her temperature, feel her pulse, listen to her breathing. Mara watched his face for any sign of hope or despair, but the man's expression gave nothing away. "You got any experience with babies?" Dutch asked eventually. "None. Figures. Most women don't, not really. They just pretend better." He adjusted the blanket around Rose. "My wife, she lost 3 before we got one that lived. Each time nearly broke her, but she kept trying. That's what mothers do." "I'm not her mother." Not really. You walked through a blizzard to save her life. Seems like a mother to me. The words settled into Mara's chest, heavy and strange. She'd been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day, each hour, that she hadn't stopped to think about what she'd become. But Dutch was right. Somewhere between that first day in the trading post and now, she'd stopped being a woman doing a job and started being Rose's mother. The realization terrified her. She has to live, Mara said quietly. Then pray she's a fighter. Mara didn't pray. She just sat there, watching Rose breathe, willing each breath to come and then the next and then the next. Hours passed. The fire burned low and Dutch added more wood. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the shelter like something alive. Mara's eyes burned with exhaustion, but she didn't let herself sleep. Couldn't. If Rose was fighting, then Mara would fight too, even if all she could do was stay awake. Sometime near midnight, Rose's fever broke. It happened so gradually that Mara almost missed it. One moment the baby was burning hot, the next she was just warm. Her breathing eased, and her small body relaxed into genuine sleep instead of the fitful unconsciousness she'd been trapped in. There, Dutch said, satisfaction in his voice. She's through the worst of it. Mara's eyes filled with tears. She was too tired to stop. She's going to be okay? She's going to be okay. Mara put her face in her hands and sobbed. All the fear and exhaustion and terror of the past week came pouring out, and she couldn't stop it. Dutch didn't try to comfort her, just let her cry herself out while he tended the fire and gave her the space to fall apart. When Mara finally looked up, her face was wet and her throat was raw, but something in her chest had loosened. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Thank whatever made you stubborn enough to walk through a blizzard. Mara stayed at Dutch's shelter for 2 more days, waiting for Rose to get strong enough to travel. The baby rallied faster than Mara expected. By the second day, she was eating again, and her cough had faded to an occasional tickle. Dutch seemed unsurprised. Kids are tougher than they look, he said. It's the adults who break easy. On the morning of the 3rd day, Mara bundled Rose back into her blankets and prepared to leave. Dutch loaded her up with supplies, dried meat, some of his fever remedy, extra blankets. Mercer know you're crazy? He asked. Probably. Good. Man should know what he's got. Mara smiled faintly. I'll tell him you said that. The walk back to the cabin took twice as long as the walk out had, mostly because Mara's body was still recovering and she refused to push too hard with Rose strapped to her chest. But the sky was clear, and the temperature had risen just enough to make the journey bearable. When she finally saw the cabin through the trees, smoke rising from the chimney, her heart lifted. Then she saw Caleb. He was standing in the doorway, and even from a distance, Mara could see the tension in his shoulders. The moment he spotted her, he was moving, crossing the clearing in long strides that ate up the distance between them. Where the hell were you? His voice was rough, almost angry. Dutch's shelter. Rose was sick. I needed... Caleb pulled her into his arms so suddenly that Mara gasped. He held her tight, one hand on the back of her head, and Mara felt him shaking. I came back and you were gone, Caleb said into her hair. The cabin was cold. There were tracks leading south, and I thought... He stopped. I thought you'd left. Taken Rose and left. I wouldn't do that. I know that now, but for 2 days I didn't know where you were or if you were alive, and He pulled back, his hands gripping her shoulders. Don't ever do that again. Rose was dying. I had to... I know. His voice cracked. I know you did. But next time you wait for me. You don't go off alone in a blizzard. You understand? Mara nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. Caleb looked down at Rose, still bundled against Mara's chest. Is she all right? She will be. Dutch gave her something for the fever, and it broke. Dutch. Caleb let out a short laugh. Of course it was Dutch. That old bastard knows more about surviving out here than anyone. He touched Rose's cheek gently. She looks better. She is better. Caleb's arms came around both of them again, and this time Mara leaned into him, letting herself be held. She was so tired, so wrung out, and for just a moment it felt good to let someone else carry the weight. Come inside, Caleb said. You're half frozen. The cabin was warm and smelled like pine and wood smoke. Caleb had brought back supplies, flour, sugar, salt, coffee, even some dried fruit that must have cost a fortune. He'd also brought fabric for diapers, a proper nursing bottle, and a wooden rattle that he seemed almost embarrassed to show her. Thought Rose might like it, he muttered. Mara took the rattle, smooth and carefully carved. You made this. Traded for it. Woman at the outpost, she makes them. It's perfect. They settled into the cabin, and Caleb made Mara sit while he heated water and cooked a proper meal, venison stew with vegetables he'd brought back. It was the best thing Mara had eaten in months, and she nearly cried again just from the taste of it. I'm sorry, Caleb said as they ate, for leaving you alone with her when she was sick. You didn't know she'd get sick. No, but I should have. He set down his spoon. I should have been here. You were getting supplies. We needed them. I still should have been here. He looked at her across the table, and Mara saw something new in his expression, something that looked almost like fear. When I came back and you were gone, I realized something. If I lost you, both of you, I don't know what I'd do. Mara's throat tightened. We're fine. This time. But what about next time? What if the fever had been worse? What if you'd gotten lost in the storm? What if... He stopped, his jaw working. I can't keep doing this alone. And I can't keep expecting you to do it alone either. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to be a real family. Not just two people surviving together, but actually... He struggled for the words. Actually, together. Mara's heart was pounding. Caleb, I'm not talking about love. I know that's not what this is. But partnership. Real partnership. You and me taking care of Rose. Taking care of each other. He met her eyes. Can we do that? Mara thought about the past months. The building and the fighting and the 1,000 small moments of learning to exist in the same space. The way Caleb had started taking Rose in the morning so Mara could sleep. The way Mara had learned to read his moods, to know when he needed silence and when he needed distraction. The way they'd built this cabin together, log by log, through exhaustion and frustration and sheer stubborn will. Yeah, Mara said, we can do that. Relief washed over Caleb's face. Good. They finished their meal in companionable silence, and later, when Rose woke crying, Caleb took her without being asked and walked her around the cabin, humming that same rough melody while Mara cleaned up. It wasn't perfect. They still snapped at each other over nothing. Still had days when the isolation and the work and the constant demands of keeping a baby alive drove them both to the edge. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. They were a family now. Messy and imperfect and nothing like what either of them had imagined, but real. Winter deepened, and with it came storms that buried the cabin under snow higher than the windows. Some mornings, Caleb had to dig them out just to open the door. The cold was relentless, and they burned through firewood faster than Caleb could cut it, which meant he spent hours each day in the forest, axe in hand, while Mara stayed inside with Rose. She'd started talking to the baby, long one-sided conversations that filled the silence. Your father is out there chopping wood like a man possessed, Mara said, bouncing Rose on her hip. I swear, sometimes I think he'd rather freeze to death than admit he can't keep up with winter. Rose gurgled, her small hand wrapping around Mara's finger. You're on my side, right? Of course you are. You're a smart girl. Mara kissed the baby's head. Smarter than both of us put together. When Caleb came in later, face red from cold and arms loaded with wood, Mara had soup waiting and Rose freshly changed. You're talking to her, Caleb said, stacking wood by the fire. She's a good listener. What do you talk about? You, mostly. How stubborn you are. Caleb smiled faintly. I'm sure she finds that fascinating. She does. Look, she's riveted. Rose was in fact falling asleep, her eyes drifting shut even as Mara held her. She's getting bigger, Caleb said, coming over to look at his daughter. Stronger. She is. Mara ran a hand over Rose's dark hair. Hard to believe she's the same baby who nearly died a month ago. Because of you. Caleb's voice was quiet. She's alive because of you. Mara didn't know how to respond to that, so she just held Rose a little tighter. That night, after Rose was asleep in her cradle and the fire had burned down to embers, Caleb and Mara sat on opposite sides of the cabin, both exhausted, both too wired to sleep. Tell me about Caroline, Mara said. Caleb's head came up sharply. What? Your wife. Rose's mother. Tell me about her. Why? Because she's part of this. part of Rose. And if I'm going to raise her daughter, I should know something about her. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low. She was young, 22 when we met, daughter of a missionary who'd set up in the foothills trying to convert trappers. He smiled faintly at the memory. She was terrible at it. Too honest, too direct. She'd tell men they were going to hell and then ask if they wanted coffee. How did you meet her? I went to the mission for supplies. She was there, arguing with her father about whether it was ethical to trade with men who killed animals for a living. Caleb shook his head. She saw me and asked me point blank if I thought trapping was murder. What did you say? I said it was survival. She said that was a coward's answer. He laughed softly. She was right. Mara could see it, a young woman with strong opinions and no filter, going head-to-head with a mountain man who probably hadn't met anyone who challenged him in years. She followed me out here, Caleb continued, against her father's wishes, against common sense. Said she didn't care about converting me, she just wanted to be with me. His voice roughened. I told her it was a hard life. Told her she'd hate it. She said she'd hate living without me more. She loved you. Yeah, she did. Caleb stared into the fire. And I loved her. Still do, if I'm being honest. That doesn't just stop. Mara had known that, but hearing him say it still stung. I'm not asking you to stop, Mara said carefully. I'm just asking you to make room for the rest of us, too. Caleb looked at her. I'm trying. I know. They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Then Caleb stood and went to his bedroll, and Mara went to hers, and they slept on opposite sides of the cabin like they always did. But something had changed. Some small door had opened. January brought the worst storms yet. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the cabin walls, and they had to keep the fire roaring day and night just to stay warm. Food was running low again, and Caleb spent hours checking his trap lines, coming back with rabbits and the occasional deer. One morning, he came back empty-handed and covered in snow, his face gray with exhaustion. Nothing, he said, collapsing by the fire. Traps are frozen solid. Animals are holed up somewhere we can't reach them. Mara looked at their dwindling supplies. Maybe 2 weeks of food left, if they rationed carefully. Maybe less. We'll make it work, she said. How? We'll hunt closer to the cabin. Set snares. I'll check the traps while you cut wood. You don't know how to check traps. Then teach me. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but he was too tired. All right, tomorrow. The next day, he showed her how to approach a trap without spooking anything nearby, how to reset it if it had been triggered, how to dispatch an animal quickly if one was caught. It was brutal work, and Mara hated every second of it, but she learned. By the end of the week, she'd caught 3 rabbits and a squirrel. It wasn't much, but it was something. You're getting good at this, Caleb said, skinning one of the rabbits. I'm getting desperate. That's different. Still counts. They were rationing everything now, food, firewood, even their energy. Rose seemed to sense the tension and fussed more than usual, her cries thin and unhappy. Mara held her and sang songs she half remembered from childhood, and sometimes Caleb would join in with his rough humming, and together they'd soothe the baby back to sleep. One night, the temperature dropped so low that the fire couldn't keep the cabin warm. Mara woke shivering, Rose pressed against her chest, and realized she couldn't feel her feet. Caleb, she said, her voice shaking. He was up immediately, feeding more wood to the fire, building it higher. But it wasn't enough. The cold was seeping in through every crack, every gap in the walls they'd chinked so carefully months ago. We need more heat, Caleb said. We're burning through wood too fast as it is. Then we share. He grabbed his bedroll and dragged it over to Mara's side of the cabin. Body heat. It's the only way. Mara hesitated, but she was too cold to argue. They piled all their blankets together and lay down side by side, rows between them, their combined warmth creating a small pocket of heat in the frozen cabin. It was strange being this close to Caleb. She could feel his breath on her hair, the solid weight of him next to her. But it was also practical, necessary, and after a few minutes, the shivering stopped. This is insane, Mara whispered. Most things we do are insane. Fair point. Rose made a small sound and they both went still, waiting to see if she'd wake. But she just shifted in her sleep and settled again, tucked safe between them. She trusts us, Caleb said quietly. She doesn't know any better. Maybe, but we haven't let her down yet. Mara thought about that, about all the ways they could have failed Rose. The fever, the cold, the 100 small dangers of living in the wilderness. But they hadn't. They'd kept her alive, kept her safe, kept her fed and warm and loved. We're doing all right, Mara said. We are. They fell asleep like that. The three of them huddled together against the cold. And when Mara woke in the morning, Caleb's arm was draped over both her and Rose, protective even in sleep. She didn't move it. February came, and with it, a break in the weather. The storms eased, the temperature rose slightly, and Caleb was able to check the farther trap lines. He came back with a deer, and they had fresh meat for the first time in weeks. We're going to make it, Mara said, watching Caleb butcher the animal. Don't say that. You'll jinx it. I don't believe in jinxes. You didn't believe in a lot of things before you came out here. Mara smiled. True. That night, they ate venison steaks and felt almost human again. Rose was 6 months old now, starting to hold her head up, to track movement with her eyes, to smile when Caleb made funny faces at her. She's going to be a handful, Mara said, watching Rose grab at Caleb's beard. Takes after you. Excuse me? Stubborn, determined, doesn't give up even when she should. Mara didn't know if that was a compliment or an insult, but she took it as the former. The days started getting longer. The snow began to melt, revealing mud and dead grass and the first hints of green pushing through. Spring was coming, slow and uncertain, but coming nonetheless. One afternoon, Caleb came back from checking the traps with news. I saw smoke, he said. About 5 miles east, someone's building. Mara looked up from where she was mending clothes. Building what? A cabin, looks like. Couple with 2 kids. They're settling. This far out? People are pushing farther into the territory every year, looking for land, for space. He sat down across from her. They might not be the last. Are you worried? No, maybe it'll be good. Having neighbors, people to trade with. He paused. People for Rose to grow up around. Mara hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been so focused on surviving each day that the idea of Rose growing up, of this place becoming a community, felt impossibly distant. You think more people will come? She asked. If we made it through the winter, others can too. It was a strange thought, this isolated valley becoming something more, something permanent. We'd need to build more, Mara said slowly. Not just for us, but for storage, for animals. Make this place actually self-sufficient. We will. Caleb met her eyes. We've got time now, and we know what we're doing. They did. Against all odds, they'd learned. Learned the land, learned each other, learned how to survive when survival seemed impossible. All right, Mara said, then let's build. Over the next weeks, they expanded. Built a small barn for animals they didn't have yet, but would eventually. Cleared more land for a garden. Fixed all the small things they'd been too busy to fix during winter. The gaps in the walls, the loose shingles, the door that never quite closed right. And slowly, the valley started to feel less like a place they were hiding and more like a place they were building. One evening, as Mara was putting Rose to bed, Caleb came in with something in his hands. What is it? Mara asked. I made something. For you. He held out a wooden frame with leather straps. It's a proper carrier for Rose, so you don't have to keep using that old sling. Mara took it, running her fingers over the smooth wood. It was beautifully made. Each piece fitted perfectly, the straps soft and flexible. When did you make this? At night, when you were asleep. Caleb looked almost embarrassed. Thought it might make things easier. It will. Thank you. She tried it on, settling Rose into the carrier. The baby fit perfectly, supported and secure, and Mara could move freely without worrying about the sling slipping. It's perfect, Mara said. Caleb smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Good. That night, after Rose was asleep and they'd settled into their now familiar routine of sharing blankets for warmth, Caleb spoke into the darkness. I'm glad you said yes, back in Ridge Hollow. Mara went still. Yeah? Yeah, I know this hasn't been easy. I know I haven't been... He paused. I haven't been the partner you deserved, but I'm trying to be better. You are better. We both are. Maybe. His hand found hers in the dark, his fingers warm against her cold ones. But I want you to know, you saved Rose. You saved me too, even if I didn't know I needed saving. Mara's throat tightened. We saved each other. They fell asleep holding hands, Rose between them, the cabin warm and solid around them. And outside, spring was breaking through the snow, bringing with it the promise of new life, new beginnings, and the slow, careful hope that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. Spring arrived with mud so thick it sucked the boots right off your feet in rain that turned everything gray and cold. Mara had imagined spring would feel like relief after the brutal winter, but instead it just felt like a different kind of hardship. The garden plot Caleb had cleared flooded twice before they gave up and dug drainage trenches around it. The roof developed 3 leaks that had to be patched in the pouring rain, and Rose, now 7 months old and teething, screamed for hours every night until Mara thought she might lose her mind. She won't stop, Mara said one night, pacing the cabin with Rose wailing against her shoulder. I've tried everything. Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending, exhaustion written across his face. Give her here. You need to finish that. And you need to sleep. Give her here. Mara handed over the baby, and Caleb settled Rose against his chest, walking her around the cabin with that same rough humming he'd used since the beginning. Rose's cries didn't stop, but they quieted slightly, turning into hiccuping sobs. Her gums are swollen, Caleb said, feeling along Rose's jaw. Teeth coming in. I know that. Doesn't help me make it stop. Nothing makes it stop. You just get through it. Mara sat down heavily on the edge of the bed frame. I'm so tired. I know. No, I mean, She stopped, pressing her hands against her face. I can't remember the last time I slept more than 2 hours straight. I can't think clearly anymore. Yesterday I put salt in the coffee instead of sugar. I noticed. And you didn't say anything? Figured you needed the coffee more than you needed me pointing out the mistake. Caleb shifted Rose to his other shoulder. You're doing fine, Mara. I don't feel fine. Nobody feels fine. That's just life out here. Should have been discouraging, but somehow it wasn't. There was something almost comforting about Caleb's blunt honesty, the way he never pretended things were better than they were. Mara lay back on the bed and closed her eyes, just for a moment. When she opened them again, dawn light was filtering through the window and Rose was asleep in her cradle. Caleb was slumped in the chair by the fire, also asleep, the mended harness fallen from his lap. Mara sat up slowly, guilt twisting in her chest. He'd stayed up all night with Rose so she could sleep. Caleb, she said quietly. He jerked awake, his hand going automatically to the knife at his belt before he registered where he was. What? What's wrong? Nothing. Rose is asleep. Caleb looked at his daughter, then at Mara, then at the window showing full morning light. Hell, I didn't mean to. Thank you. He rubbed a hand over his face. You needed sleep. So did you. I can sleep later. He stood, stretching with a wince. We've got work to do. The Hendersons are coming today. Mara had forgotten. James and Ellen Henderson, the couple Caleb had spotted building 5 miles east, had sent word they'd be visiting. It was the first time they'd have guests, and Mara felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. The cabin's a mess, she said, looking around at the scattered tools, drying laundry, and general chaos of living. It's a cabin in the wilderness. They'll understand. But Mara still spent the morning tidying, stacking Caleb's trapping gear in one corner, hanging the laundry outside now that the rain had stopped, sweeping the dirt floor even though it was pointless. She wanted to make a good impression, though she couldn't quite articulate why it mattered. The Hendersons arrived around noon, riding a single horse with their 2 children perched behind them. James was tall and thin with a farmer's hands, and Ellen was small and round with a smile that seemed genuine. Their kids, a boy of maybe 6 and a girl around 4, stared at everything with wide eyes. Thank you for having us, Ellen said, sliding off the horse. We've been so curious about our neighbors. We're glad for the company, Caleb said, shaking James's hand. They settled around the cabin and Mara served coffee and the few precious biscuits she'd made from their dwindling flour supply. The adults talked about the weather, the building, the challenges of settling in territory this remote. The children sat quietly at first, but when Rose woke and started fussing, the little girl, her name was Sarah, came over to peer into the cradle. "She's tiny," Sarah whispered. "She's a baby," Mara said. "You were tiny once, too." "Can I hold her?" Mara glanced at Ellen, who nodded. "All right, sit down and I'll put her in your lap." Sarah sat very carefully, and Mara placed Rose in her arms, showing her how to support the baby's head. Rose blinked up at this new face, and Sarah beamed. "She likes me," Sarah announced. "She does," Mara agreed, even though Rose probably had no opinion either way. While the children were occupied, the adults' conversation turned more serious. "We've had some trouble with wolves," James said. "Lost 2 chickens last week, and I'm worried about the kids." "Build your coop higher," Caleb said, "and closer to the house. Wolves are smart, but they're also lazy. They won't work too hard for a meal if there's easier prey elsewhere." "We were also thinking about hunting parties," James continued. "Pool our resources, cover more ground. Would you be interested?" Caleb considered. "Maybe. Depends on the timing. And I was hoping," Ellen said, turning to Mara, "that we might trade knowledge. I've got experience with preserving food, and James says you made it through the winter, which means you know things we don't." Mara felt a small spark of something that might have been pride. "I'd be happy to share what I know. And I could teach you weaving, if you're interested. I brought a small loom with us." The idea of making cloth instead of constantly mending the same worn garments was almost too good to imagine. "I'd like that." They talked for hours, trading information and stories. Ellen told them about the settlement they'd come from in Missouri, how they'd sold everything to come west. James talked about his plans for farming the valley, about crops that might survive the short growing season. And slowly, Mara began to see the shape of something larger than just survival. A community, small and fragile, but real. When the Hendersons finally left, promising to visit again soon, Mara felt energized in a way she hadn't in months. "That was good," she said to Caleb. "It was. We should do it again. Maybe invite Dutch too, and anyone else who's settled nearby." Caleb looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "You planning a social gathering?" "Maybe. Is that so strange?" "For the woman who once told me she hated people?" "A little." Mara smiled. "I hate most people. But the Hendersons seem all right." Over the following weeks, Mara found herself visiting Ellen regularly, usually with Rose strapped to her back in the carrier Caleb had made. Ellen taught her the basics of weaving, and in exchange, Mara showed her how to set snares and preserve meat through smoking. The two women developed an easy friendship built on mutual need and respect. "I'm glad you're here," Ellen said one afternoon as they worked the loom together. "James is wonderful, but sometimes I just need to talk to another woman." "I know what you mean. How are things with Caleb, if you don't mind me asking?" Mara considered the question. "Better. We're figuring it out." James said Caleb's first wife died in childbirth. After fever. Ellen's expression softened. "That must be hard for both of you." "It is." Mara paused. "Sometimes I feel like I'm competing with a ghost." "Are you?" "I don't know, maybe." Mara adjusted the thread on the loom. "He loved her. Still does, and I'm just the woman who was there when he needed help." "That's not nothing, Mara. Being there when someone needs you, that matters." "Does it? Or am I just convenient?" Ellen stopped working and looked at Mara directly. "Do you love him?" The question caught Mara off guard. I don't know. That's honest, at least. We agreed from the start this wasn't about love. It was about survival, about giving Rose a family. And now? Mara thought about the past months, about building the cabin together, about sharing blankets on the coldest nights, about the way Caleb had started checking on her before he checked the traps, making sure she'd eaten before he did, about the small moments of tenderness that had crept into their partnership without either of them quite noticing. "Now it's complicated," Mara said finally. Ellen smiled. "That's usually when it starts getting interesting." That night, Mara couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. She watched Caleb across the cabin as he carved something from a piece of wood, his hands steady and sure. Rose was asleep in her cradle, making the small snuffling sounds that meant she'd sleep for at least another hour. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said. Caleb looked up. "Sure. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me? His hand stilled. Where's this coming from? Just answer the question. Caleb set down his carving. No, I don't regret it. Even though I'm not her? Not Caroline? Something shifted in Caleb's expression. You're not Caroline, you're right about that. But I never wanted you to be. Then what did you want? I wanted... He stopped, choosing his words carefully. I wanted someone who could survive out here. Someone strong enough to handle the winter and the isolation and the 1,000 things that go wrong every single day. Someone who wouldn't break. That's all? At first, yeah. That's all. He met her eyes. But things change. People change. Have you changed? I think so. Have you? Mara considered. The woman who'd stepped forward in that trading post felt like a different person now. Softer in some ways, harder in others. She'd learned to kill rabbits and birth calves and function on no sleep. She'd learned to love a child who wasn't hers and to trust a man who'd been a stranger. Yeah, she said. I've changed. Good changes? I don't know yet. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of things unsaid hanging between them. I still think about her, Caleb said quietly. Caroline, not every day like I used to, but she's still there. And I don't know if that'll ever completely go away. It hurt to hear, but Mara appreciated the honesty. I'm not asking you to forget her, Mara said. I'm just asking you to make space for me too, for us. I'm trying. I know, so am I. Caleb stood and crossed the cabin, sitting down next to Mara on the bed frame. I'm not good at this. At talking about feelings, at being a husband to someone who's alive and right here instead of a memory. I'm not good at it either. So we'll both keep being bad at it together? Mara smiled faintly. Seems like that's been our strategy so far. Caleb's hand found hers, his thumb running over her calloused knuckles. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. Even when things are hard, even when we're fighting or exhausted or running out of food, I'm glad it's you. Mara's throat tightened. Me too. They sat like that for a while, hands linked until Rose woke crying and the moment broke. But something had shifted again, some small piece of the wall between them crumbling away. Summer came fast and fierce, bringing with it heat that made the cabin stifling and mosquitoes that swarmed in clouds. The garden finally started producing, thin, scraggly vegetables that didn't look like much but tasted like hope. Mara spent her days weeding and watering while Rose napped in the shade, and Caleb worked on expanding the barn. More settlers arrived in the valley throughout the summer. 2 more families built cabins within riding distance, and Dutch came down from his shelter to trade and share news. What had been empty wilderness 6 months ago was slowly becoming something else. One evening, as Mara was putting Rose to bed, Caleb came in with a strange expression on his face. What? Mara asked. I was thinking about expanding the cabin. We just built the barn. I know, but... He hesitated. Rose is getting bigger. She'll need her own space eventually. And if we're going to stay here, make this a real home, we should build for the future. What kind of future? Caleb met her eyes. The kind where we're not just surviving. The kind where we're actually living. Mara felt something flutter in her chest. That's a lot of building. I know, but we've done it before. We can do it again. They spent the next weeks planning. An addition to the cabin that would give them 2 more rooms, one for Rose and one for storage. A proper root cellar for preserving food. Maybe even a second floor eventually, if they could manage it. You're planning for more children, Mara said one night as they sketched out designs by firelight. Caleb's hand stilled. Would that be so bad? I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. Neither had I. But then I started thinking about Rose growing up alone out here, and he shrugged. She should have siblings, if we can give her that. Mara's heart was pounding. They'd shared a bed for warmth all winter, but they'd never discussed making the marriage real in that way, never crossed that final line. Is that what you want? She asked quietly. I want a family, a real one, not just the arrangement we started with. Caleb looked at her. But only if it's what you want too. Mara thought about it, about what it would mean to truly commit to this life, to this man, to a future she'd never dared imagine back in Ridge Hollow. I need time, she said. Take all the time you need. But time had a way of forcing decisions. In August, Mara got sick. Not dangerously sick, just a lingering illness that left her weak and nauseous for days. Ellen came to help, bringing soup and taking care of Rose while Mara recovered. "You're pregnant," Ellen said matter-of-factly. Mara's head snapped up. "What? No, I'm not. Caleb and I haven't—" "You sure about that?" Mara thought back to the winter, to all those nights pressed close together for warmth, half asleep, and seeking comfort in the dark. She'd thought, she'd assumed, but now she wasn't certain. "I don't know," Mara whispered. Ellen squeezed her hand. "Give it a few weeks. You'll know for sure." 3 weeks later, Mara knew. Her body was changing in ways she recognized now, having watched other women go through it. She was pregnant. She told Caleb one evening after Rose was asleep. He stood very still, his face unreadable. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes." "How?" "Does it matter how?" Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "No, I suppose it doesn't." He looked at her. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified." "Yeah, me too." They stood in silence, the magnitude of it settling over them. Another child. Another life depending on them. Another winter to survive, but this time with a baby who would arrive right in the middle of it. "We'll need to finish the addition before the snow comes," Caleb said finally. "That's what you're worried about? The addition? It's what I can control." He crossed to her, putting his hands on her shoulders. "I can't control whether this pregnancy goes well or whether the baby will be healthy or whether we'll all make it through. But I can build you a room and make sure we have enough firewood and food. So that's what I'm going to do." It was so completely Caleb, practical to the point of being almost cold, but Mara understood. This was how he showed love. Through action, through building, through the relentless work of making sure his family survived. "All right," she said, "then we build." They threw themselves into construction with a desperation that bordered on obsession. Caleb worked from before dawn until after dark, and Mara helped as much as her changing body would allow. The Hendersons came to assist, and even Dutch showed up with his tools, grumbling about young people not knowing how to pace themselves. "You're going to work yourself to death," Dutch told Caleb. "Got to get it done before winter." "Winter's 4 months away. 3 months, and that's not enough time." Dutch shook his head but kept working. The addition went up faster than the original cabin had, mostly because they knew what they were doing now. But it was still brutal work. Mara's pregnancy made everything harder. She tired easily, couldn't lift heavy logs anymore, had to stop frequently to rest. It frustrated her to no end. "I'm useless," she said one afternoon, watching Caleb and James lift a beam into place. "You're growing a human," Ellen pointed out. "That's not useless." "It feels useless when there's work to be done." "Let the men handle the heavy lifting. You can do everything else." So Mara focused on the finishing work, chinking gaps, building furniture, preparing the space for a new baby. She made a cradle from pine, smaller than Rose's, but just as sturdy. Made blankets from fabric Ellen had woven. Tried to prepare for something she couldn't quite imagine yet. One night, lying in bed with Caleb's hand resting on her growing belly, Mara finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "What if I can't do this? What if I'm not a good enough mother?" "You're already a mother. You're doing fine with Rose." "That's different. She's easy now. She sleeps through the night. She eats solid food. She's becoming her own person. But a newborn, going through all of that again while taking care of Rose and running the household? We'll manage." "How?" "The same way we've managed everything else. Badly at first, then slightly less badly, then eventually we figure it out." Despite everything, Mara laughed. "That's your inspirational speech?" "I'm not good at inspirational speeches, but I am good at not giving up, and so are you." He pressed his hand more firmly against her belly. "We'll be all right, Mara. All of us." She wanted to believe him, and lying there in the dark, feeling the small flutter of movement beneath Caleb's hand, she almost did. The addition was finished in late September, just as the first cold snap hit. They had 2 new rooms, a proper root cellar stocked with preserved food, and enough firewood to last through 2 winters if necessary. The cabin that had been a desperate shelter was now a home. Rose took her first steps that October, wobbling across the cabin floor into Mara's arms. She was 11 months old, dark-haired and stubborn, with Caleb's eyes and Caroline's smile, or so Caleb said. Mara had never known Caroline, but she could see the way Caleb looked at his daughter sometimes, seeing echoes of the woman he'd lost. It didn't hurt as much anymore. Or maybe Mara had just gotten used to it. She's going to be walking everywhere soon, Mara said, steadying Rose as the baby tried to lunge toward Caleb. Better build a fence around the property then. Caleb, she's a year old, not a wild animal. Have you met her? She's definitely a wild animal. Rose grabbed Caleb's beard and yanked, giggling when he yelped. See? Caleb said. Wild animal. Mara watched them together, her husband and the daughter who wasn't hers by blood, but was hers in every way that mattered, and felt a swell of something she couldn't quite name. Love, maybe. Or belonging. Or just the simple, profound relief of having found her place in the world. November brought the first snow, and with it, a different kind of fear. Mara's pregnancy was progressing normally, according to Ellen, but the memory of what had happened to Caroline hung over everything. Caleb tried to hide his worry, but Mara could see it in the way he watched her, the way he insisted she rest more, do less. I'm not going to break, Mara said, after he'd stopped her from carrying water for the third time that day. I know. Then stop treating me like I will. I'm just being careful. You're being suffocating. Caleb's jaw tightened. Caroline seemed fine too, right up until she wasn't. There it was, the fear he'd been carrying finally spoken aloud. Mara softened. I'm not Caroline. I know that. Then trust me to know my own body. I do trust you. I'm just... He stopped, struggling with the words. I'm scared. All right? I'm terrified something's going to happen to you, and I'll lose you too, and I can't do that again. Mara's throat tightened. You won't lose me. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll fight like hell to stay. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. That's all I'm asking. December arrived with bitter cold and storms that rattled the cabin walls. Mara was enormous now, moving slowly, aching constantly. Rose, sensing something was different, became clingy and fussy, refusing to let Mara out of her sight. Mama, Rose said, reaching for Mara. It was the first time she'd said it clearly, and Mara's eyes filled with tears. That's right, sweetheart. I'm your mama. Caleb watched from across the room, something complicated in his expression. She called you mama, he said quietly. Is that all right? Yeah, it's more than all right. He came over, putting his arm around Mara's shoulders. You are her mama, in every way that counts. The baby came 2 weeks into January, during a blizzard that buried the valley under 4 feet of snow. Mara's labor started in the middle of the night, and Caleb rode through the storm to get Ellen, leaving Mara alone with Rose and her fear. By the time Ellen arrived, frozen and exhausted, Mara was deep into labor and beginning to panic. I can't do this, Mara gasped between contractions. Yes, you can, Ellen said firmly, warming her hands by the fire before examining Mara. You're strong, and this baby is ready. Now let's bring her into the world. Her? Or him? We'll find out soon enough. The labor was long and brutal, and there were moments when Mara understood viscerally how Caroline had died doing this, how women died all the time doing this. But Ellen was there, steady and calm, and Caleb held Mara's hand and didn't flinch even when she screamed. Just after dawn, as the storm finally broke, Mara's second child was born. A boy, tiny and red and squalling, with a full head of dark hair. He's perfect, Ellen said, wrapping the baby in blankets and placing him on Mara's chest. Mara looked down at her son, and felt something inside her break open. This was hers, not inherited, not taken on out of necessity. Hers. Hello? She whispered, touching his small face. Caleb stood at the edge of the bed, staring at the baby with an expression Mara couldn't read. Come here, Mara said. He came, sitting carefully on the bed. He's so small. He'll grow. Does he have a name? Mara had been thinking about this for months. I was thinking Samuel, after my father. Samuel Mercer. Caleb tested the name. I like it. He reached out tentatively and touched his son's hand. Samuel's tiny fingers wrapped around Caleb's finger, and Mara watched her husband's face crumple. He's ours, Caleb said, his voice breaking. Really, ours. Yeah, Mara whispered. He is. Ellen cleaned up and made sure both mother and baby were stable. then wrapped herself in blankets by the fire to rest. Rose, who'd been sleeping through the whole ordeal, woke and demanded to see the baby. "Gentle," Caleb warned, lifting Rose up to look at her new brother. Rose stared at Samuel with intense curiosity, then tried to poke his eye. "Maybe not that gentle," Caleb amended, pulling her hand back. They spent the day in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Mara fed Samuel and slept and fed him again, the rhythms of newborn care coming back easier this time. Caleb took care of everything else: Rose, the fire, the animals, the million things that needed doing even when a baby had just been born. When Ellen finally left the next day, promising to check on them in a few days, Mara looked around the cabin at her family. Rose playing with the carved animals Caleb had made her. Samuel asleep in his cradle. Caleb stoking the fire, making sure they stayed warm. This was her life now, not the life she'd imagined back in Ridge Hollow, invisible and unwanted, but something better, something real. "Thank you," Mara said to Caleb. He looked up. "For what?" "For giving me this, for letting me be part of it." Caleb crossed to the bed and kissed her forehead. "You didn't just become part of it, you built it. This family, this home, everything we have. You built it as much as I did. We built it together." "Yeah," Caleb said, smiling. "We did." Outside, winter raged on. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and the presence of each other, they were safe. They were home. And they were, against all odds and expectations, exactly where they were supposed to be. Samuel was 6 weeks old when the Henderson boy broke his arm. Mara was nursing the baby by the fire when James came pounding on the door, his face white with panic. "It's Thomas," he gasped. "He fell from the barn roof. Ellen's with him, but she said we need you." Mara looked down at Samuel, then at Caleb, who was already reaching for the baby. "Go," Caleb said. "I've got him." Mara grabbed her coat and followed James out into the February cold. The Henderson cabin was a 20-minute ride, and James pushed his horse hard enough that Mara worried they'd both end up with broken bones. But they made it, and Mara found Ellen in the cabin with Thomas, the boy crying softly while his sister Sarah watched with wide, terrified eyes. The arm was broken badly, bone pushing against skin in a way that made Mara's stomach turn. But she'd seen worse. Had helped Dutch set a trapper's leg 2 years ago. Had learned enough from watching and doing to know what needed to happen. "Sarah, I need you to get me clean cloth and hot water," Mara said, her voice calm even though her hands were shaking. "Ellen, hold him steady." She worked quickly, feeling along the bone, finding where it had fractured. Thomas screamed when she began to manipulate it back into place, and Mara had to steel herself against the sound. "I know it hurts," she told him, "but I need you to be brave for just a little longer." It took 3 tries to get the bone aligned properly. By the time she was done, Thomas had passed out from the pain, which made splinting the arm easier. Mara bound it with strips of wood and cloth, wrapping it tight enough to hold, but not so tight it would cut off circulation. "He'll need to keep this on for at least 6 weeks, Mara said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Maybe longer. And he can't use the arm at all, understand?" Ellen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. I didn't know what to do." "You did fine. You kept him calm until I got here." James put his hand on Mara's shoulder. "We owe you." "You don't owe me anything. We're neighbors. This is what neighbors do." But as Mara rode back to her own cabin, she realized something had shifted. The Hendersons had come to her for help, had trusted her with their child's life. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming someone people relied on. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Over the following months, it happened again. And again. A difficult birth at the new settlement 3 miles north. Mara rode out in the middle of the night and helped deliver twins. A trapper with an infected wound, she lanced it and packed it with herbs Dutch had taught her to use. A child with a fever that wouldn't break. She sat with the family for 2 days, monitoring the girl until the fever finally subsided. "You're becoming the valley's healer," Caleb said one evening, as Mara came home exhausted from another emergency call. "I'm not a healer, I'm just doing what needs to be done." That's what healers do. Mara didn't know what to say to that. She'd never thought of herself as anything special, just a woman who'd learned to survive and was now helping others do the same. But as spring turned to summer and summer to fall, she couldn't deny the pattern. People sought her out, asked her advice, trusted her with their lives and the lives of their children. And slowly, The woman who'd once been invisible in Ridge Hollow became the person everyone in the valley knew by name. Rose turned 2 that summer, wild and fearless and utterly convinced she could do anything her father could do. She followed Caleb everywhere, demanding to help with the traps, the animals, the building. Caleb, who'd once been terrified to hold his own daughter, now carried her on his shoulders through the forest, teaching her the names of trees and how to read animal tracks. "She's going to be impossible," Mara said, watching Rose insist she could chop wood despite being barely tall enough to lift the axe. "She's going to be strong," Caleb corrected, "like her mother." The word still caught Mara off guard sometimes. Rose called her mama without hesitation now, had no memory of any other mother. And while Mara knew Caroline's shadow would always be part of their family, it no longer felt like a weight, just a quiet presence, honored but not haunting. Samuel was crawling by September, getting into everything and putting things in his mouth that absolutely should not go in mouths. He was easier than Rose had been as a baby, slept better, cried less. But he had his own challenges. A stubborn streak that meant he'd work at a problem until he solved it or exhausted himself trying. "He's yours," Caleb said, watching Samuel determinedly try to climb onto a chair that was twice his height. "Excuse me? That stubbornness, that refusal to quit. That's all you." Mara couldn't argue with that. The valley's population had grown to nearly 30 people by that fall, spread across a dozen homesteads. Someone suggested they organize a harvest gathering, a chance for everyone to come together, trade goods, share food, strengthen the fragile community they were building. The gathering happened at the Henderson farm, the largest cleared space in the valley. Families came from miles around bringing food and goods and children who ran wild through the fields. There was music, James had a fiddle, and dancing, and more laughter than Mara had heard in years. "This is something," Dutch said, appearing at Mara's elbow with a cup of cider. "It is. You helped build this, you know. Not just the community, but the trust. People feel safe here because of you. That's not... I'm just one person. One person can change everything." Dutch took a drink. "I've been out here 30 years, watched dozens of settlements try to take root. Most of them failed because people didn't help each other, didn't trust each other. But this valley, it's different. And that's because of people like you and Caleb setting the example." Mara watched Rose chase Sarah Henderson through the crowd while Caleb held Samuel, pointing out things to the baby who was too young to understand but watched everything with solemn attention. "We just didn't want to die alone," Mara said quietly. "Nobody wants to die alone. But most people don't do anything about it." Dutch nodded toward her family. "You did." The gathering lasted until after dark, and when Mara finally rode home with Caleb and the children, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Contentment, maybe. Or just the simple satisfaction of belonging. But life in the valley wasn't all harvest gatherings and community. Winter came again, as brutal as ever, and with it came losses. A family lost their cabin to fire and had to be taken in by neighbors. A hunter didn't return from a trap line, and his body was found weeks later, frozen. A child died from a sickness that Mara couldn't stop, no matter how hard she tried. That last one nearly broke her. "I couldn't help her," Mara said to Caleb, pacing the cabin while Rose and Samuel slept. "I tried everything, and she just slipped away. You did everything you could. It wasn't enough." "Sometimes it's not." Caleb pulled her into his arms. "That doesn't mean you failed. It just means some things are beyond our control." "I hate that." "I know, but that's life out here. Hell, that's life everywhere." Mara pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself cry for the little girl she couldn't save, for all the people she'd helped but couldn't guarantee, for the weight of being the person everyone turned to when things went wrong. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she whispered. "You can, and you will, because that's who you are." It wasn't reassurance exactly, just fact, and somehow that made it easier to bear. 3 years passed in a rhythm of seasons and survival. Rose turned 5, reading the few books they had and demanding stories about everything. Samuel turned 3, talking in full sentences and following his sister everywhere. And Mara found herself pregnant again. "Third time's the charm," Caleb said when she told him. "Or third time's what finally kills me." "You said that about Samuel." And I meant it then too. But this pregnancy was easier than the previous one. Mara's body knew what to do now, and she worked through most of it, only slowing down in the final weeks. The baby came in early spring, another girl, small and dark-haired, who they named Clara after Caleb's mother. With 3 children, the cabin that had seemed spacious now felt cramped. They needed more room, more storage, more everything. So they built again, added another room, expanded the barn, cleared more land for crops. "We're building a ranch," James observed one day, helping Caleb frame out the new addition. "We're building a life," Caleb corrected. And they were. Not just for themselves, but for their children and the community that had grown around them. The valley now had nearly 50 residents, and someone had started calling it Mercer Valley, though Caleb insisted that wasn't official. "It's your valley," Sarah Henderson said, now a teenager and helping Mara with the younger children. "Everyone knows it." "It's everyone's valley," Mara corrected. "We just got here first." But names have a way of sticking, and Mercer Valley it became. Rose was 7 when she announced she wanted to learn healing from Mara. "You're too young," Mara said. "I'm not too young. I can read and write. I can help with Samuel and Clara. I can set snares. Why can't I learn healing?" "Because healing means seeing things children shouldn't see." "I've already seen things. I watched you help Mrs. Patterson with her baby. I saw the Henderson boy's arm after he broke it again. I'm not scared." Mara looked at her daughter, this fierce, stubborn girl who'd somehow grown from the screaming baby in that trading post into a person with her own opinions and determination, and realized Rose was right. She wasn't too young. She was ready. "All right," Mara said, "but you do exactly what I say. When I say it, no arguing." Rose grinned. "I promise." It was a lie, of course. Rose argued about everything, but she also learned fast, absorbing information like a sponge and asking questions that forced Mara to think deeper about her own knowledge. "Why do we use willow bark for fever?" Rose asked. "Because it works." "But why does it work?" "I don't know the why. I just know it does." "That's not good enough. We should understand why." And so Mara started experimenting, testing different remedies, keeping records of what worked and what didn't. Rose was right. Understanding the why made them better healers. It also made them partners in a way Mara hadn't expected, working side by side to help people. Samuel, meanwhile, had attached himself to Caleb, learning everything about trapping and hunting and surviving in the wilderness. At 5, he could track a rabbit and skin it without flinching. At 6, he'd shot his first deer with his father's help. "He's too young for that," Mara protested. "He's the right age," Caleb said. "Out here, children grow up fast. Better he learns now when I can teach him properly." Mara hated that he was right, but she also understood it. This wasn't Ridge Hollow, where children could afford to be children. This was the frontier, and survival meant learning early. Clara, the baby, was sweet and quiet, content to play by herself and watch her siblings with solemn attention. She was the opposite of Rose in every way, and Mara loved her fiercely for it. "She's going to be the one who keeps everyone sane," Ellen observed, watching Clara carefully stack blocks while Rose and Samuel argued about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. "Someone has to," Mara said. The valley continued to grow. By the time Rose was 10, there were nearly 100 people spread across 24 homesteads. Someone built a proper meeting hall. Someone else started a school, and Rose and Samuel attended when they could be spared from work at home. Mara's reputation as a healer had spread beyond the valley. People rode from settlements a day's journey away seeking her help. She delivered babies, set bones, treated illnesses, and sat with the dying when there was nothing else to be done. "You should charge for this," Caleb said after Mara had spent 3 days helping a family with scarlet fever and came home exhausted. "Charge what? Half these people barely have enough to feed themselves. Then they can pay in trade. Food, supplies, labor. You can't keep giving everything away for free." "I'm not giving it away. I'm helping people." "You're running yourself into the ground." He was right about that, too. Mara was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix, worn down by the constant demands and the weight of being responsible for so many lives. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted. "Then don't stop. Just slow down. Let Rose help more. Train other people. You don't have to do everything yourself." It was good advice. Hard to follow, but good. So Mara started training other women in basic healing, sharing her knowledge instead of hoarding it. Rose became her primary assistant, skilled enough at 12 to handle many cases on her own. "You're better at this than I was at your age," Mara told her daughter. "That's because you taught me better than you were taught." It was true. Mara had learned through desperation and trial and error. Rose was learning through careful instruction and practice. The next generation would be even better prepared. One evening, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Caleb found Mara sitting outside, looking out at the valley spread below them. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "About how far we've come. From that first winter when I wasn't sure we'd survive, to this." She gestured at the lights scattered across the valley, each one representing a family, a home, a life. "We did good," Caleb said. "We did." Mara leaned against him. "Do you ever think about her, Caroline?" "Sometimes. Less than I used to." He put his arm around Mara's shoulders. "I loved her. She'll always be part of me. But you're my life now. You and Rose and Samuel and Clara and this valley and everything we built together. I used to think I was just a replacement, the woman you settled for because you had no other choice. And now? Now I know I was never a replacement. I was the beginning of something different, something we made together." Caleb kissed her temple. "Took you long enough to figure that out." "Took both of us long enough." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over the valley. Somewhere below, a dog barked, a child laughed, life continuing in all its messy, imperfect glory. "I'm glad I stepped forward that day," Mara said quietly. "In the trading post. When everyone else stepped back, I'm glad I didn't." "So am I." Rose turned 15, then 16. Boys started noticing her, and Mara had to resist the urge to chase them all off with a rifle. "She's allowed to have suitors," Caleb pointed out. "She's allowed to wait until she's 30. I married you when you were 28. "Exactly, so she can wait 2 more years after that." But Rose had no interest in marriage anyway. She was too busy learning, studying, expanding her knowledge of healing. She'd started corresponding with a doctor in the territorial capital, trading letters about medicine and treatments. It was the closest thing to formal training available, and Rose devoured every piece of information. "I want to be better than good," Rose told Mara. "I want to be the best healer in the territory." "Why?" "Because people deserve the best. They deserve someone who knows what they're doing, not just someone who's guessing." Mara heard the implied criticism and tried not to be hurt by it. Rose wasn't wrong. Mara had been guessing for years, learning as she went. But she'd also saved lives, helped people, made a difference. "You're already better than I ever was," Mara said. "That's not true." "It is. And I'm proud of you for it." Rose's expression softened. "I learned from the best." Samuel was 14 and restless, too big for the valley and too young to leave. He talked constantly about exploring farther territories, seeing what was beyond the mountains. "You sound like your father," Mara said. "Is that bad?" "No, just familiar." She looked at her son, taller than her now, with Caleb's build and his own fierce independence. "But promise me you'll be careful. The world is bigger and harder than you think." "I know. You've told me 100 times. I'll tell you 100 more if it means you come home safe." Samuel hugged her, and for just a moment he was her little boy again instead of the young man he was becoming. "I promise," he said. Claire was 8, still quiet, still observant. She'd started helping with the younger children in the valley, showing a natural patience and gentleness that neither of her siblings possessed. "She's going to be a teacher," Ellen predicted. "She's going to be whatever she wants to be," Mara said. But Ellen was probably right. 20 years after that desperate day in the trading post, Mara stood in front of the meeting hall addressing a gathering of valley residents. They were discussing building a proper clinic, a dedicated space for healing with room for supplies and patients. "It would serve the whole valley," Mara said, "and eventually the surrounding settlements. We could train more healers, create a network of care." The vote was unanimous in favor. Construction began that spring, and by summer the clinic was complete. It wasn't much, 2 rooms and a storage shed, but it was official, permanent, real. Rose moved into the clinic, making it her own. Samuel had left to explore the northern territories but sent letters regularly. Clara had indeed become the valley's teacher, working with the dozen children who attended the small school. Mara and Caleb, approaching 50 now, had finally slowed down. Not stopped. They'd never stop. But slowed. Let the next generation take over some of the burden. "We did it," Mara said one evening, sitting on the porch they'd built onto the cabin 5 years ago. "Did what?" Caleb asked, though he knew. "Built a life. A real one. The kind I never thought I'd have. The kind you deserved all along." Mara thought about the woman she'd been in Ridge Hollow. Invisible, unwanted, convinced she'd die forgotten. That woman felt like a stranger now. "You know what I learned?" Mara said. "What's that?" "That sometimes the boldest thing you can do is choose yourself, before anyone else does, before the world tells you you're worth choosing." "Is that what you did, that day in the trading post?" "That's exactly what I did. I saw a chance for something different, and I took it. Not because I knew it would work out, but because staying invisible was worse than risking everything." Caleb took her hand. "And you got stuck with me. I got lucky with you, with Rose, with all of it." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Even the hard parts. Maybe especially the hard parts." They sat in silence, watching the sun set over Mercer Valley. Over the community they'd helped build, the lives they'd touched, the legacy they were leaving. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Mara asked quietly. "Caroline, of what we did with Rose, with our family." Caleb considered the question. "Yeah, I think she would be. She loved Rose more than anything, and you've given her a good life, a full life. We both have. We tried, anyway. We did more than try. We succeeded. Grandchildren came. Rose, despite her protestations about never marrying, fell in love with the territorial doctor she'd been corresponding with and brought him home to meet the family. They married and had twins who were as wild and stubborn as their mother had been. Samuel returned from his exploring with a wife from a northern settlement and built his own cabin on the far side of the valley. He and his wife had 4 children in quick succession, all of them outdoorsmen like their father. Clara married the schoolmaster from a neighboring valley, and they had one son who was quiet and thoughtful and loved books. Mara found herself surrounded by family in a way she'd never imagined possible. The cabin that had started as a desperate shelter now anchored a compound of buildings housing 3 generations. "This is what I wanted," Caleb said one evening, watching his grandchildren play in the yard. "When I first came to that trading post with Rose, terrified and lost, I wanted this. Family, legacy, proof that we survived." "We didn't just survive," Mara corrected. "We lived, and they had. Not perfectly, not easily, but fully. They'd built a home, raised children, created a community. They'd faced down winters and illness and loss and kept going. They'd chosen each other every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." On Mara's 60th birthday, the valley threw a celebration. Nearly 200 people showed up, 3 generations of families who'd made Mercer Valley home. They told stories about Mara's healing, about births she'd attended and lives she'd saved. They thanked her for being the heart of their community. "I didn't do it alone," Mara protested. "No," Rose said, standing to address the crowd. "She didn't do it alone. She did it with my father, with all of you, with everyone who chose to help instead of turn away. But she started it. The day she stepped forward, when everyone else stepped back, she started something that became this." Mara looked around at the faces. People she'd helped, children she'd delivered, families she'd mourned with and celebrated with. Every single one of them here because somewhere along the way, someone had chosen to help instead of walk away. That night, lying in bed next to Caleb, Mara thought about the journey that had brought her here. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Any of it?" "Not for a second. You?" "No, not even the hard parts. Maybe especially not the hard parts because those are what made us strong. We were always strong. We just didn't know it yet." Mara smiled in the darkness. "Maybe you're right." Years passed. Caleb's hair went completely gray, then white. Mara's hands developed arthritis that made healing work harder, so she focused on teaching instead. Rose took over the clinic completely, expanding it with help from her doctor husband. Samuel became the valley's unofficial leader, the person everyone turned to for difficult decisions. Clara's school grew to accommodate 40 students. The valley prospered. Not rich, never rich, but stable. Safe. The kind of place where children could grow up knowing they belonged, where families could build futures, where people took care of each other. On a cold morning in late winter, Mara stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked out at everything they'd built. She was 72 now, slower but still sharp, still engaged with the community she'd helped create. Caleb came up behind her, moving stiffly but still solid. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About that first winter, when I thought we might not make it. We made it. We did more than make it. We built something that'll outlast us. That's the whole point, isn't it? Building something bigger than yourself." Mara turned to face him. He was old now, his face lined with decades of sun and wind and hard work. But his eyes were still the same creekwater gray, still looking at her the way they had that day she'd proposed marriage in the trading post. "I love you," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud. They'd never needed the words before, had shown it in 1,000 other ways, but she wanted to say it now, to name what they'd built together. "I know," Caleb said, smiling. "I've known for years." "When did you know?" "The day you walked into that blizzard to save Rose. That's when I knew you weren't just helping me. You'd become her mother, our family." "And when did you fall in love with me?" Caleb thought about it. "I don't think there was one moment. It just happened, slow and steady, like ice melting in spring. One day I looked at you and realized I couldn't imagine life without you." "That's the best kind of love," Mara said. "The kind that builds over time instead of burning out fast." "Yeah, it is." They stood together in the doorway, watching the sun rise over Mercer Valley. 3 generations of their family lived here now, scattered across homesteads and houses they'd built together. The valley had a school, a clinic, a meeting hall, and plans for a church. It had a future. "We did good," Caleb said. "We did," Mara agreed. And standing there in the doorway of the cabin they'd built with their own hands, surrounded by the community they'd helped create, Mara Whitlock Mercer understood something fundamental. She'd spent the first 28 years of her life invisible, convinced she'd die forgotten and unwanted. But she'd been wrong about herself. She hadn't needed someone to choose her. She'd needed to choose herself first. That day in the trading post, when she'd stepped forward while everyone else stepped back, she hadn't been desperate. She'd been brave. She'd seen an opportunity to become something more than invisible, and she'd taken it. Everything else, the marriage, the family, the community, the life she'd built, had flowed from that single act of courage. Sometimes the boldest thing you can do is bet on yourself when no one else will. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't the ones that start with lightning, but the ones that build slowly, through choice and commitment and showing up every day. Sometimes the woman no one chose becomes the woman everyone needs. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very stubborn, you get to build a life that matters. Not because it was easy, but because it was yours. Mara had built that life. With Caleb, with Rose and Samuel and Clara, with everyone in this valley who'd chosen to help instead of turn away. She'd built it one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. And that, she thought, was more than enough. That was everything.